The Other tab is where we're going to find the rest of the features and options in the projector that we have access to via the remote that aren't one of our other primary tabs that we've already covered. So in this Other tab, we have subtabs: Picture, Position, Advanced, Display, Projector, and Multi. Picture mode follows and tracks just like the remote. We can choose which picture mode we're going to work out of. Graphic tends to be the most common. We can adjust our contrast, our brightness, our color, our tint, our sharpness, and utilize a noise reduction algorithm. We can also turn on a waveform monitor that shows up on the projector as part of the OSD, and we can utilize that that waveform, to see the incoming signal and adjust different values, say our contrast and our brightness, to make sure they're maximized. That waveform will have a line, and you can move that line up or down, and wherever that line is at is the portion of the signal that is being read. Our color temperature is currently set to default. If you have any color matching turned on, this is going to be overridden and set as user, because the color matching does override white values. But if we're not utilizing color matching, we can come into here and set a manual color temperature, say 6500, or we can use a user and then adjust the white balance gain on the high and the whites, and on the low and the blacks. I definitely recommend doing it from the 7 color white value over doing it in the color temperature, although it can also do it without affecting the rest of the color. Here we can set our gamma values, traditional gamma values, but we can also do the simulated HDR. So here's our HDR 500, HDR 1000, and our HLG. The 1000 should be Adobe, and the 500 is HDR 10. Setting these, while they don't conform exactly to those HDR standards, they do a very good approximation, and I can tell you the difference is night and day. System Daylight View is an algorithm Panasonic uses with their projectors to compensate for ambient light or light washout on your screen. The higher you push the System Daylight View, the more saturated or compensated your colors are going to be on the surface. It does a pretty good job of accounting for ambient light, to the point where I almost always use 1 or 2 on large screen show environments. And if you're doing any small room or projector mapping on buildings with ambient light, you'll want to run it pretty much at the full 6. You can easily turn it off and on and see the difference that it makes, and choose for yourself whether that works for your show. Dynamic contrast should always be off. We never want something in the projector to perform in a way that's not consistent. You do have the option, if you're utilizing dynamic contrast, say if you're an integrator or this is a home theater or a theater type environment, you can manually set all the dynamic contrast functions. But sets a 1, 2, or 3 that utilizes the internal algorithms of the projector. And what this will do is fluctuate the brightness of the projector, the laser brightness, based on every frame of video coming into the projector from the signal. So if the signal coming in, that frame of video is a lower brightness on average across a surface, say a night scene, the projector is going to lower its overall luminosity. So that way the scene stays more true to what you're supposed to see. It raises the relative contrast for the content you're watching. Like I said, something great for theater or home theater type environments, but definitely not wanted for any type of rental and staging or large show. And then you can change the native color space as well to be a 709 or a DCI for, say, theater, or a 2020. Of course, these are both emulated because the projector can't actually hit those values. The next tab is Position, and in here this is a newer tab, but we have the ability to adjust the convergence of the projector. Very similar to in geometry, we can affect just the red, the green, or the blue chip. This is the same thing. It just does it more on a large scale, works in quadrants. So this will help us digitally clean up our convergence if it's off. Under Advanced, we can turn on Digital Cinema Reality. What this does is compensate or frame values of motion video. So that way you don't get that sort of soap opera effect of something that's a lower frame rate being scaled up to a higher frame rate. We have blanking, where you can effectively turn off pixels on the upper left, right, or bottom portion of the screen. This does not go totally black. This only reduces you down to projector black. So there is still some amount of ambient light hitting the portion of the surface that is blanked. Frame response can be set to fast or fixed. This is good for interlaced. You can tell it to process interlaced content faster so you have less of a delay. You could manually add a frame delay if that was needed, so that way your signal being processed takes longer before it shows up at the projector. Frame creation is a function that the projector having a higher frame rate than the video or the content will interpolate and create frames in between. So it's not just going to double frames from 30 to 60, it's going to actually create new frames in between that help smooth motion, especially across fast moving content. And film detection is an algorithm that helps offset if the projector has detected, or if you know the content was sort of telesign, right? If it was film converted to video, which means the frame rate and pull down has already been applied. This helps compensate for that and the type of frame creation it uses. Raster position. This lets you move your content around on the raster or the chip of the projector. If you're using a 16:9 content and our chip is 16:10, you can move the content up and down in that available vertical space that you have. Quad pixel drive is the 4K. That is the wobulation the projector is doing to give it full 4K. You can turn this off and the chip operates as a native 2560 by 1600 chip. The problem is whether this is off or on dictates whether or not you can utilize a lot of functions in the projector. It really should be on. In display options, we have a lot of settings. Large screen correction. This is an algorithm that helps to account for the difference that an audience member might see or perceive in a screen when they're far away versus sitting really close on a very large screen. You can set the screen aspect ratio, and if it does not fill the chip, you can then move it around to center it on the chip or center it wherever you want on the raster. You can set up your auto signal adjustments. Your background color should always be black unless you have your own custom logo, and your startup should always be none unless you have your own custom logo. But you are able to input into the projector your own custom logo that could be shown at either of these times. Cutoff is a useful feature where you can turn off a chip. Right? If I cut off the red, I am no longer showing red, so all my whites appear as teal or cyan. It's good for converging and blending projectors. I always cut a color out of each projector so that way I have like a yellow and a cyan projector, and I know which grid is which grid. Can also be used for troubleshooting purposes as well. Shutter setting. A lot of the laser projectors don't have mechanical shutters. This is definitely true for the single chip. None of them have mechanical shutters. So all they do is turn the laser banks off and on or fade them in and out to simulate a physical shutter. The 3-chip projectors do have physical shutters, but I believe they're disabled by default from the factory. So you have to turn on the mechanical shutter and then tell it what you want it to do. For instance, at Evolve, I have set up all of our projectors to close when the projector turns off. That way there is a physical shutter protecting the DMD, the wobulator, and the prism whenever the projector is off. This is also good for concert venues or anywhere that there's going to be a laser light show. You want to be able to turn on a physical shutter just in case any errant lasers might shoot into the projector. Those lasers could quickly damage your DMD chips. You need some kind of physical way to block the light from coming into the projector, especially if it's off. You can configure the on-screen display, the OSD, and choose which position on screen that it is. You can rotate it so that it matches the rotation of either the projector or the image. You can also change the design, turn on the memory, the guide, and turn off warning messages. For your SDI inputs, you can change the different signal level functions. Same thing for digital link or your slots. This is our 12G card, or if we had other 4K, right? If this was a regular projector, we would have DVI, VGA. Those would all be options for the signal level manipulation and adjustments that we want to do as well. We can set up our backup input setting. Here, we can choose a backup input. So if we're coming in on slot 1, SDI 1, let's say we're going to do slot 1 SDI 3 instead, automatic switching. So if the first signal drops out for any reason, the projector loses sync on that input, it will automatically switch to the other inputs. The simul input setting or simultaneous input setting is where if you're utilizing simultaneous inputs, meaning the same signal being utilized into either 2 or 4 inputs for varying degrees of reasons, but for this one is the same signal but different refresh rates. Let me explain a little better. Say you send two 60 Hz inputs. It's the same content, but one input's getting the first frame and the second input's getting the second frame. So they're doing every other frame. This allows the projector to display 120 Hz video, even though the inputs cannot do that. And if you did 4 times speed, now you can do 240 Hz videos via 4 60 Hz inputs. Let's scroll up, jump to projector setup. Here we can change the projector method, whether it's front, floor, rear, ceiling, etc. Most projectors nowadays have an accelerometer, which can let them choose or automatically decide whether they're ceiling mounted or floor mounted. You just have to choose whether it's front or rear. You can change the standby mode to be normal or eco, but let me tell you, Panasonic eco mode is the only way to turn it on is via a remote, if I recall. The wake on LAN and everything else gets disabled, if I'm correct. You can change the no signal shutoff, more eco settings. When it first turns on, whether you use the last memory or it jumps into standby or fully powered on. You can also choose which input it grabs upon startup. The sides of some of the projectors have an AC voltage monitor. You can turn that off or on here. Set the time zone. Multi-projector sync. So the projectors do have the ability to sync. They can sync shutter commands. They can sync their dynamic contrast values, among other things. So what you would do is set one projector to master, the other projectors to slave, and then turn on your contrast or shutter sync. When a projector is set to slave, anytime a contrast change is sent or a shutter from the main projector, the rest of them follow all in sync. Now, to do this, the sides of the projectors have a sync SDI in and out. And you have to daisy chain all the projectors and create a complete loop in order to do this. It's very tedious and not something you can do in a rental staging environment. If, for instance, you want to send synced shutter commands to your projectors, it's easier to use third-party software or their projector monitoring and control software because that has the capability to do it as well. Finally, multi-display mode. You can set up multi-display mode to where you're showing 4 images at once utilizing the 4 SDIs. Normally, the quad SDI is reserved for doing a 4K image. where everything is frame locked and frame synced with the signal. But utilizing multi-display, we can do that, but have 4 different signals and give ourselves sort of a quad split. We can even choose which inputs we're using per quadrant of the window. There you have it. That's the wrap up of Geometry Manager Pro. And look forward to other more specific videos where I'm able to actually show you the auto warp or uniformity control with a camera and real world examples.